Samantha had been working at Le Grand Elite for 3 years, and in that time she had built a reputation, but not the kind that management appreciated. She was known among her co-workers for being efficient, but also for her arrogance and impatience, especially toward customers she deemed unimportant. In the beginning, she had been an enthusiastic and friendly waitress, always greeting customers with a smile and ensuring they had a great experience. But as time went on, her attitude changed. She began to see her job as a burden rather than a service. The endless demands of wealthy patrons, their complaints about minor details, and the entitlement she often encountered wore her down. Instead of maintaining professionalism, she developed a sharp tongue and a dismissive attitude toward customers she felt didn't deserve her best service. Her co-workers had noticed this shift in behavior, but nobody dared to confront her directly. After all, Samantha had been at the restaurant for years, and she had built a level of seniority over the newer employees. Even the manager, Mr. Collins, had warned her a few times about her attitude, but she had brushed it off, thinking, as long as I do my job, they won't fire me. That evening, the restaurant was exceptionally busy. The tables were filled with elite clientele, celebrities, and businessmen, all of whom expected nothing but the best. Samantha was already feeling overwhelmed. The orders were piling up, and she was in no mood for another demanding customer. Then a tall young man walked in. He was dressed simply but elegantly, well-fitted navy suit, polished shoes, and an air of quiet confidence. He wasn't accompanied by bodyguards or assistants, which was unusual for the high-profile customers who usually dined at Le Grand Elite. Samantha took a quick glance at him and assumed he was just another rich kid trying to act important. When he took a seat at one of her tables, she barely acknowledged him. Instead of greeting him properly, as she was trained to do, she continued stacking dishes from another table. "Water, please," the young man said politely, looking at the menu. Samantha rolled her eyes. Another entitled kid expecting special treatment, she thought. Without looking up, she responded in a dull, uninterested tone, Yeah, I'll get to you in a minute." The young man said nothing. He simply nodded and waited. Samantha continued serving other customers, intentionally ignoring the young man for several minutes before finally bringing him a glass of water. Instead of setting it down carefully, she placed it on the table with a slight thud. "There," she said shortly. The young man gave her a polite smile, unfazed by her behavior. He continued looking at the menu, carefully deciding what to order. As he took his time, Samantha grew impatient. "Do you need help deciding, or are you just going to sit there all night?" she asked, her tone slightly condescending. The young man looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "I'll have the steak medium rare," he said simply. Samantha let out a short chuckle. "You know, our chef doesn't take special requests from just anyone. We cook it how we cook it. If you don't like it, go somewhere else," she said, smirking. A few nearby customers overheard her and glanced over, surprised at her rudeness. One of her co-workers nudged her and whispered, "Hey, maybe be a little nicer? He might be someone important." Samantha scoffed. "He's just some rich kid. If he wanted better service, he should have brought a bodyguard or at least looked important." Little did she know, she had just insulted the owner of the entire restaurant. Throughout the meal, Samantha continued to treat the young man with the same level of disrespect. When he asked for a napkin, she took her time bringing it. When his steak finally arrived, she dropped the plate onto the table with a careless attitude, not bothering to ask if he needed anything else. The young man remained calm. He didn't argue, complain, or even show any sign of frustration. He simply ate his meal, took a few sips of water, and observed. Samantha assumed he was just a shy, privileged teenager who wasn't used to standing up for himself. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The evening continued, and Samantha felt satisfied that she had put him in his place. To her, he was just another spoiled kid who probably had never worked a real job in his life. She believed that he wouldn't dare complain because he was too timid. But what she failed to realize was that this was not just any customer. This was Barron Trump, the son of former President Donald Trump and the new owner of Le Grand Elite. As the night came to an end, the young man finished his meal, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and signaled for the check. Samantha brought it over, still completely unaware of his identity. "Hope everything was okay for you," she said flatly, not really caring. The young man smiled slightly. "It was an interesting experience," he said. Samantha shrugged and walked away, thinking she would never see him again. But in just a few minutes, she would get the shock of her life. A few moments later, the restaurant's manager, Mr. Collins, walked over to the young man with a respectful bow of his head. "Mr. Trump, I hope everything was to your satisfaction," he said warmly. Samantha, who was standing nearby, froze in place. "Mr. Trump?" Her mind raced. Wait, what did he just say? She looked at the young man again, suddenly realizing why he looked familiar. It was Barron Trump, the son of Donald Trump, the heir to one of the most powerful family names in America, and, most importantly, the new owner of Le Grand Elite. Her face turned pale. Her heart pounded in her chest. Had she really just insulted her own boss all night without realizing it? Barron Trump stood up, shook Mr. Collins' hand, and turned to Samantha. He gave her a small, knowing smirk. "You might want to work on your customer service skills," he said calmly before walking out of the restaurant. Samantha stood frozen, realizing that her arrogance had just cost her everything. Samantha stood frozen in shock as she watched Barron Trump exit the restaurant. Her mind raced with everything that had just happened. Had she really spent the entire evening treating the owner of the restaurant with disrespect? Had she ruined her career in a single night because of her arrogance? Her hands trembled as she picked up the now empty plate from his table. What had she done? The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had dismissed him, insulted him, and treated him as if he were a nobody. The worst part, he hadn't even reacted. She had assumed that if she were rude to him, he would either leave quietly or complain to the manager. But instead, he had sat through the entire experience, remaining polite and calm. Now, she understood why. He had been observing, studying her behavior, testing her. Samantha's heart pounded as she tried to recall everything she had said to him throughout the night. She had barely acknowledged him when he first arrived. She had rolled her eyes when he asked for water. She had spoken to him rudely when he asked about the menu. She had refused to take his steak order seriously. She had placed his food on the table carelessly. She had assumed he was just another privileged, entitled young man who didn't deserve respect. But the truth was far from that. Barron Trump wasn't just any customer. He was the owner of the restaurant. She glanced around at the other guests, many of whom had witnessed her behavior. She could see some of them whispering to each other, probably discussing what had just happened. Did they know who he was? Had they figured it out before she did? She turned toward the restaurant's manager, Mr. Collins, hoping for some reassurance. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as bad as she thought. But the look on Mr. Collins' face told her otherwise. His expression was serious, his lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't angry. No, he looked disappointed. "Samantha, come to my office," he said, his voice low but firm. Her stomach dropped. The walk to the manager's office felt like the longest walk of her life. Her knees felt weak and her palms were sweaty. She had been called into the office before, but this time, she had a terrible feeling that this wasn't going to be a simple warning. Mr. Collins closed the door behind her and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated before lowering herself into the chair, her hands gripping the sides as if bracing for impact. He sighed, sitting across from her. He folded his hands together and looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Samantha," he said slowly, "do you have any idea what just happened?" She swallowed hard and nodded. I was rude to a customer," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Collins raised an eyebrow. "A customer," he repeated. "Is that all you think he was?" She bit her lip. She knew what he was getting at, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. "That customer," he continued, "is the owner of this restaurant. The man who signs our paychecks. The man who could, with one word, decide whether or not you have a job tomorrow." Samantha's throat tightened. "I didn't know. That's the problem," Mr. Collins interrupted. "You didn't know because you didn't care. You judged him based on his appearance and treated him as if he wasn't worth your respect. And now, you have to face the consequences." She felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Please, Mr. Collins, I didn't mean," he held up a hand to stop her. "Samantha, this isn't just about tonight. We've had complaints about your attitude before. Customers have told us that you're rude, dismissive, and unprofessional. We've warned you multiple times, and tonight was the final straw." Her breath hitched. Am I being fired?" Mr. Collins exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. "I don't see any other choice." Samantha felt like the ground had just been pulled out from under her. She had worked at Le Grand Elite for 3 years. It had become her second home. She had convinced herself that no matter how rude she was too valuable to be let go. But now, she had just lost everything. Tears slipped down her cheeks. "Please, is there anything I can do?" she pleaded. Mr. Collins shook his head. "Samantha, respect is a basic requirement in this industry. It's not something you learn after 3 years. It's something you should have had from the start." He slid a letter across the desk toward her. Her hands shook as she picked it up and read the words. Effective immediately, Samantha Reynolds is no longer employed at Le Grand Elite due to repeated complaints of unprofessional behavior and poor customer service. Her heart shattered. As she walked out of the office, she felt numb. The once familiar restaurant now felt like an entirely different place. The tables, the guests, the silverware, everything felt distant, like a world she no longer belonged to. Her co-workers watched as she grabbed her belongings from the break room. Some looked at her with pity, others with indifference. She had burned too many bridges for anyone to truly feel sorry for her. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, she realized something terrifying. She had spent so much time looking down on others, assuming they weren't worth her respect. And now, she was the one left behind. This was a lesson she would never forget. Samantha stood in the middle of the restaurant, her mind spinning as she processed what had just happened. The young man she had been so rude to, rolling her eyes, dismissing his requests, and treating him like an unimportant customer, was none other than Barron Trump, the owner of the restaurant. Her breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. How could she have been so blind? She looked around, searching for someone, anyone who could confirm that this was some kind of mistake. But the expressions on her co-workers' faces told her everything she needed to know. Some of them looked shocked, others sympathetic, but a few wore smug expressions as if they had been expecting this to happen. Mr. Collins, the restaurant manager, stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching her reaction. He had clearly known the truth all along. "Wait, he's the owner?" Samantha stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Collins nodded. "Yes, Barron Trump owns Le Grand Elite and several other high-end restaurants. He visits from time to time to observe the service and customer experience. Tonight, he came in unannounced and you failed the test." Samantha's stomach twisted into knots. She felt lightheaded, her legs weak beneath her. This wasn't just a rude customer complaining. This was the person who could end her career with a single decision. She replayed the entire evening in her mind. The way she had ignored his presence, dismissed his polite requests, and treated him like a nobody. She had assumed he was just another rich kid who expected special treatment. But in reality, he had been testing her, evaluating her performance. And she had failed miserably. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I didn't know." "That's no excuse," Mr. Collins said firmly. "Respect isn't reserved for important people. It should be given to every customer who walks through these doors. You had no idea who he was, yet you treated him poorly. What does that say about how you treat others?" Samantha swallowed hard, unable to respond. He was right. She had built a reputation for being rude, dismissive, and impatient with customers she deemed unworthy of her time. And now, her worst behavior had been exposed to the one person who had the power to do something about it. As the weight of her actions sank in, a new fear took hold of her. Would Barron Trump fire her? She turned her gaze toward the restaurant's entrance, where Barron had just stepped outside. He stood by the sidewalk, talking quietly with a member of his security team. Despite everything, he still looked calm, composed, and utterly unbothered by the events of the evening. A thought flashed through her mind. Maybe it wasn't too late to fix this. With a deep breath, she forced her legs to move, pushing past the tables and out the door. The cold night air hit her face as she hurried toward him. "Mr. Trump, please," she called out desperately. Barron turned to face her, his expression unreadable. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time that night, she felt truly exposed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He was just disappointed. "I am so sorry," she blurted out, her voice shaking. "I had no idea who you were. I never would have." Barron held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "That's the problem, Samantha," he said calmly. "You shouldn't treat people differently based on who they are. I came in tonight as a customer, and you made it clear how you feel about customers." Tears burned in her eyes. I didn't mean to be disrespectful," she pleaded. "It was a mistake. Please, give me another chance." For a moment, Barron simply studied her, as if trying to determine whether she was truly sorry or just afraid of the consequences. Then he spoke. "What would you have done if I were just another customer?" Samantha hesitated. She didn't have a good answer, because the truth was she wouldn't have done anything. She would have carried on with her rude attitude, dismissing people as she always had. Barron sighed. "I don't fire people without giving them a chance to learn from their mistakes," he said finally. "But this isn't just about one night. I've reviewed complaints about your service before. Your attitude has been a problem for a long time." Samantha's heart pounded. "Please, I'll do anything to make it right." Barron nodded slowly. "You want another chance?" "Yes," she said quickly, desperate for hope. "Then prove that you can change," he said simply. "Come back tomorrow. You won't be a waitress. You'll be a customer." Her eyes widened in confusion. The customer?" Barron gave a small nod. "I want you to sit at a table, order food, and experience what it feels like to be on the other side. I want you to understand how customers feel when they're treated with disrespect." Samantha swallowed. This wasn't what she had expected. But if this was what it took to keep her job, she would do it. "Yes, I'll do it," she said without hesitation. Barron gave her one last look before turning to leave. "I hope you learned something," he said over his shoulder. Samantha stood there, watching him disappear into the night. For the first time in her life, she realized just how much she had to change. Samantha stood frozen outside the restaurant, her heart still racing. She had never imagined that a single night at work could change her life so dramatically. Barron Trump had given her an opportunity, but it wasn't just a second chance. It was a test. As she walked home that night, her mind replayed every mistake she had made. The arrogance, the impatience, the dismissiveness, all the things she had done without thinking. Now, for the first time, she was forced to reflect on them. She barely slept that night. The thought of returning to Le Grand Elite not as a waitress, but as a customer filled her with dread. Would her co-workers mock her? Would the other waitstaff treat her the same way she had treated others? And worst of all, what if she realized just how bad she had truly been? The next evening, Samantha hesitated outside the restaurant. It was a strange feeling, standing there as someone who wasn't about to work. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The maitre d' greeted her with a polite nod, but his eyes held a flicker of amusement. Everyone knew why she was here. "Table for one," he asked. Samantha nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, please." She was led to a small table near the window, a spot she had often ignored when assigning tables to guests. Now, sitting there, she noticed how different everything felt from this side. The menu felt heavier in her hands. The chatter of the restaurant seemed louder, and the time between ordering and receiving food felt much longer than she had ever realized. Then, the real test began. A waitress, one of her co-workers, approached with a notepad, her expression unreadable. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone neutral. Samantha hesitated. Was that how she had sounded? Cold, uninterested, like she was simply going through the motions? She ordered a simple meal and waited. For the first time, she truly understood how powerless a customer could feel. The waitress took her time bringing water. The bread came cold. When the food finally arrived, she barely made eye contact. Samantha had done all these things to people before, and now she was the one experiencing it. She shifted in her seat, uncomfortable. Every moment felt like a mirror reflecting her past behavior. The way the waitress ignored her, the lack of a smile, the minimal effort in service, it was all too familiar. This was how she had treated people, and now she hated being on the receiving end of it. As she forced herself to finish her meal, she thought about all the customers she had dismissed, all the people she had made feel small. She had always assumed they were just being difficult when they complained, but now she realized they had every reason to be upset. By the time she was ready to leave, her perspective had completely shifted. She got up and walked over to the waitress, forcing herself to speak. "I just wanted to say, I understand now," she admitted. "I know I've been rude in the past, and I'm sorry." The waitress raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but after a moment she nodded. "I hope you mean that." Samantha did. More than anything, she wanted to prove that she had changed. As she walked toward the exit, she spotted Barron Trump near the bar. He was watching her with his usual calm expression, as if waiting to see what she had learned. Samantha took a deep breath and walked over to him. "I get it now," she said quietly. "I was wrong. I thought I was just doing my job, but I wasn't treating people like they mattered." Barron nodded slowly. "And what will you do with that realization?" Samantha didn't hesitate. "Change." For the first time, a small smile appeared on Barron's face. "Then let's see if you mean it." Her journey wasn't over yet, but it had finally begun. Samantha left Le Grand Elite that evening feeling a mixture of relief and determination. She had faced the consequences of her past behavior, and now she was ready to change. But words alone weren't enough. She had to prove it through her actions. The next day, she returned to the restaurant. Not as a guest this time, but as a waitress once more. Barron Trump had given her another chance, but she knew it wasn't just a favor. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that she had truly learned from her mistakes. She stepped into the staff room, where her co-workers were already preparing for the evening rush. The air was thick with tension. Some of them glanced at her with skepticism, others with quiet amusement. She could tell they were waiting for her to fail again. Samantha took a deep breath. "I know I messed up before," she said, addressing them directly. "And I know I don't deserve your trust right away, but I want to be better, and I'm going to prove it." Silence. Then one of the older waiters, Miguel, chuckled. "We'll see about that." And so, her real test began. A new approach to service as the doors opened for the evening. Samantha focused on every little detail she had once ignored. When a guest entered, she greeted them with a warm smile. She made eye contact, genuinely trying to make them feel welcome. She took their orders patiently, listening carefully instead of rushing them through. When she brought food to the tables, she did so with care, making sure the plates were placed neatly, double-checking orders before serving. And instead of ignoring small details, she took the time to notice when a guest needed a refill, an extra napkin, or just a friendly interaction. It wasn't easy. The habit of impatience, of brushing people off, still lingered in her instincts. But every time she caught herself slipping, she forced herself to remember how it had felt to be on the other side. Throughout the night, she could feel the difference. Customers who had once been frustrated by her attitude were now smiling. Some even complimented her service, something that had rarely happened before. Her co-workers noticed too. At first, they watched her skeptically, waiting for her to fall back into old habits. But as the night went on, their expressions softened. Even Miguel, the toughest critic, gave her a nod of approval. By the time the shift ended, Samantha was exhausted, but it was a good kind of exhaustion. She had given her best, and for the first time in a long time, she felt proud of the work she had done. A conversation with Barron Trump as she was about to leave, she heard a voice behind her. "You did well tonight." She turned to see Barron Trump standing near the bar, his sharp eyes studying her. Samantha straightened. "Thank you," she said sincerely. He leaned against the counter, thoughtful. "It's not easy to change. Most people don't. They make excuses, blame others. You could have done the same, but you didn't." She nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "I didn't like the person I was before. I don't want to be that kind of person anymore." Barron studied her for a moment. "Then don't be." It was such a simple statement, yet it held so much meaning. Change wasn't about words or apologies. It was about actions repeated every day until they became second nature. As she left the restaurant that night, she felt lighter than she had in a long time. The road ahead, Samantha's journey wasn't over. She still had to prove herself to show that her change was real and lasting. There would be tough days, days when she'd be tempted to slip back into old habits, when impatient customers would test her, when the exhaustion of the job would make kindness feel impossible. But now, she had something she hadn't had before: perspective. She understood the power of a single moment, of a single interaction. The way a small act of kindness could change someone's entire experience. The way respect and patience could turn a routine dinner into a memorable evening. And most importantly, she understood that true humility isn't just about admitting when you're wrong. It's about proving that you're willing to do better. As she walked home, she smiled to herself. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just working a job, she was building a future.